Part 2 of Chapter 27 of To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee.
But why should he try to burgle John Taylor's house? He obviously didn't know John was home, or he wouldn't have tried. Only lights John shows on Sunday nights are the front porch and back in his den.
You don't know if Bob Ewell cut that screen. You don't know who did it, said Atticus. But I can guess. I proved him a liar, but John made him look like a fool. All the time Ewell was on the stand, I couldn't dare look at John and keep a straight face. John looked at him as if he were a three-legged chicken or a square egg. Don't tell me, judges. Don't try to prejudice juries. Atticus chuckled.
By the end of October, our lives had become the familiar routine of school, play, study. Jem seemed to have put out of his mind whatever it was he wanted to forget, and our classmates mercifully let us forget our father's eccentricities. Cecil Jacobs asked me one time if Atticus was a radical. When I asked Atticus, Atticus was so amused I was rather annoyed, but he said he wasn't laughing at me. He said, "You can tell Cecil I'm about as radical as Cotton Tom Heflin." Aunt Alexandra was thriving. Miss Maudie must have silenced the whole missionary society at one blow, for Auntie again ruled the roost. Her refreshments grew even more delicious. I learned more about the poor Maroonesses' social life from listening to Mrs. Merriweather. They had so little sense of family that the whole tribe was one big family. A child had as many fathers as there were men in the community, as many mothers as there were women. J. Grimes Everett was doing his utmost to change the state of affairs and desperately needed our prayers.
Macomb was itself again, precisely the same as last year. And the year before that, the only two minor changes. Firstly, people had removed their windows and automobiles the stickers that said RNA. NRA. We do our part. I asked Atticus why. He said it because the National Recovery Act is dead. I asked who killed it. He said 9 old men.
The second change in Macomb.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Am I reading now?
Voice. Yeah.
Alright. The second change in Macomb this last year was not one of our national significance. Until then, Halloween in Macomb was a completely unorganized affair. Each child did what he wanted to do, with assistance from other children if they were anything to be moved, such as placing a light buggy on top of the livery stable. But parents thought things went too far last year when the peace of Miss Tootie and Miss Fruity was shattered. Miss Tootie and Fruity Barber were maiden ladies, sisters, who lived together in the only Macomb residence, Boston, a cellular Barber ladies who rumored to be Republicans, having migrate from Clanton, Alabama in 1911. Their ways were strange to us, and why they wanted a cellar nobody knew, but they wanted one. Only they spent the rest of their lives chasing generations of children out of it. Han Solo dies.
Mrs. Tootie and Fruity, their names were Sarah and Francis. Aside from their Yankee ways, they're both deaf. Miss Tootie denied it and lived in a world of silence. But Miss Fruity, not about to miss anything unemployed, an ear trumpet so enormous that Jem declared it was a loudspeaker from one of those dog victuals. With these facts in mind and Halloween at hand, some wicked children had waited until the Mrs. Barber were thoroughly asleep, slipped into their living room, nobody but the Radleys locked up at night, stealthily made away with their sick fortune, therein and hid in the cellar. I deny having taken part in such a thing. I heard him! was the cry that awoke the Mrs. Barber's neighbors. At dawn next morning, heard him drive a truck up to the door. I can't see. And stopped around like horses. They're in New Orleans by now. Miss Tootie was sure those traveling for the first sellers who came through down 2 days ago had purloined their furniture. Gee, Ark, they were, she said. Syrians.
Mr. Hectate was summoned. He surveyed the area and said he thought it was a local job. Miss Fruity said she'd know a make-home voice anywhere, and there was no make-home voices in that parlor last night, rolling their R's all over her premises. They were nothing less than a bloodhound must be used to locate their furniture. Miss Tootie insisted, so Mr. Tate was obligated to go 10 miles out on the road, round up the county hounds, and put them on the trail. Mr. Tate started them off at Mrs. Barber Front's, the Barber Front steps, but all they did was run around at the back of the house and howl the cellar door. When Mr. Tate sent them in motion 3 times, he finally guessed the truth. By noontime that day, there was no barefoot child to be seen in Maycomb, and nobody took off his shoes until the hounds were returned.
So the Maycomb ladies said things would be different this year. The high school auditorium would be open. There would be a pageant for the grown-ups, apple bobbying, taffy pulling, pinning the tail on the donkey for the children. There would also be a prize of 25 cents for the best Halloween costume created by the wearer. Jim and I both groaned. Not that we'd ever done anything. It was the principle of the thing. Jim considered himself too old for Halloween anyway. He said he wouldn't be caught anywhere near the high school at something like that. Oh well, I thought Atticus would take me.
I soon learned, however, that my services would be required on stage that evening. Mrs. Grace Merriweather had composed an original pageant entitled Maycomb County at Astra per Aspera, and I was to be a ham. She thought it would be adorable if some of the children were costumed to represent the county's agricultural products. Cecil Jacobs would be dressed up to look like a cow, Agnes Boone would make a lovely butterbean, another child would be a peanut, and on down the line until Mrs. Merriweather's imagination and the supply of children were exhausted.
That was a bad voice
Our
crack.
only duties, as far as I could gather from our 2 rehearsals, were to enter from stage left as Mrs. Merriweather, not only the author but the narrator, identified us. When she called out pork, that was my cue. Then the assembled company would sing, Maycomb County, we will aye be true to thee, as the grand finale, and Mrs. Merriweather would mount the stage with the state flag.
My costume was not much of a problem. Miss Crenshaw, the local seamstress, had as much imagination as Miss Merriweather. Miss Crenshaw took some chicken wire and bent it into a shape of a cured ham. This she covered with a brown cloth and patent to resemble the original. I could duck under, and someone could pull the contraption down over my head. It came almost to my knees. Miss Crenshaw thoughtfully left 2 peepholes for me. She did a fine job. Jem said I looked exactly like a ham with legs, and were several discomforts though. It was hot, it was a close fit, if my nose itched, I couldn't scratch it, and once inside, I could not get out of it alone.
Dylan, you have to read When Halloween. No, he's reading, Sean. He's reading.
When Halloween came, I assumed that the whole family would be present to watch me perform, but I was disappointed. Atticus said as tactfully, okay, this is really uncomfortable, as he could, that he just didn't think he could stand a pageant tonight. He was all in. He had been in Montgomery for a week. Please stop throwing things at me. And come home late that afternoon. He thought Jim might escort me if I asked him color runners. Han Solo said.
Again.
What?
Aunt Alexandra said she just had to get to bed early. She'd been decorating the stage all afternoon and was worn out. She stopped short in the middle of her sentence. She closed her mouth and opened it to say something, but no words came. "What's the matter, Auntie?" I asked.
Oh, nothing. Somebody just walked over my garage.
She put away from her whatever it was, gave her a pinprick of apprehension, and suggested that I give the family a preview in the living room. So Jem squeezed me into my costume, stood at the living room door, called out, "Pork,"
I want to say that.
exactly as Mrs. Merriweather would have done, and I marched in. Atticus and Aunt Alexandra were delighted.
I repeated my part for Calpurnia in the kitchen, and she said that I was wonderful. I wanted to go across the street to show Miss Marty, but Jam said she'd probably be at the pageant anyway.
After that, it didn't matter whether they went or not. Jem said he would take me. Thus began our longest journey together.
Colin Running's Han
End
Solo's daughter.
of chapter
Thank you.
25.
Joining us.
Thank you for joining us here.
This has been To Kill A Mockingbird.